Silas Brennan had done everything right for 32 years of living on this earth except for one swing of the axe on a Tuesday afternoon in September. The morning had been ordinary, the kind of ordinary that tricks you into thinking the world is stable. Sunlight came through the cabin window in a long gold stripe across the floor. Coffee boiled on the stove. Out past the doorframe, the Kansas prairie stretched flat and gold and endless in every direction, the grass already turning from summer green to autumn brown, the sky so wide and blue it made you feel like something very small standing at the bottom of a very large bowl. Willa Brennan stood at the cabin door watching her husband split wood. 28 years old, slim with gray-green eyes that noticed things other people missed and a habit of going quiet when she was thinking, which was most of the time. She held a cup of coffee that had gone cold 10 minutes ago because she had forgotten to drink it. She forgot to drink things when she watched Silas work. Not because he was beautiful to watch, though he was, because there was something in the way he moved that made her believe the world had an order to it, that if you did things the right way in the right sequence with the right amount of care, then things would be all right. Silas split wood the way he did everything. Not fast, not showy, but steady and precise, each swing landing exactly where the last one had the axe biting into the grain of the cottonwood log and opening it clean down the center. He stacked the split pieces in rows, bark side up so rain would run off, spaced 2 fingers apart, so air could pass between them and dry the wood before winter came. He had been doing this since August, working an hour each morning and an hour each evening building the pile log by log the way you build anything that matters, which is slowly and with attention. He was the kind of man that men over 60 remember meeting once or twice in their lives. The kind who did not talk about what he was going to do. He just did it, and when it was done, he moved on to the next thing. He understood the principle behind every task he performed. He did not just stack wood. He understood why bark side up mattered, why air circulation between the pieces mattered, why cottonwood burned different from oak and oak different from hickory. He carried this understanding quietly the way some men carry faith, not as something to display, but as something to rely on when everything else fell apart. Willa would later realize that this was the most important thing Silas ever gave her. Not the cabin, not the land, not the 5 years of marriage that she would replay in her mind for the rest of her life. He gave her the habit of asking why. Why does this work? What is the principle that habit planted by a man who never knew he was planting it would be the thing that saved her after he was gone? The axe slipped at 4:17 in the afternoon. There was no drama to it, no warning. Silas had swung 10,000 times before, and the axe had always gone where he aimed it. This time the blade caught the edge of a knot in the cottonwood, deflected left, and came down across the palm of his left hand, which was steadying the log on the chopping block. He pulled his hand back and looked at it the way you look at something that does not make sense yet. The cut ran diagonal across his palm, deep enough to see the white of tissue beneath the skin before the blood came. Not deep enough to hit bone, not deep enough, he thought, to matter. Willa boiled water. She washed the wound. She wrapped it in clean cloth that she had boiled separately because her mother had taught her that clean cloth on a wound could mean the difference between healing and fever. Silas sat at the table and let her work, and said it was nothing, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who had survived worse and would survive this. He would be splitting wood again by Thursday, he told her, the words meant to reassure, but landing in the room like stones dropped in still water. He was not splitting wood by Thursday. By Wednesday morning the hand was swollen to twice its normal size. The skin around the cut stretched tight and shiny and hot to the touch. A redness had begun to spread from the wound, creeping outward like a stain. Silas said it was normal, but his voice had changed, lost the certainty it carried the day before. Willa said nothing, but she checked the hand every hour, and every hour the redness had traveled a little farther, and every hour the smell had changed a little, becoming sweeter, thicker. Wrong. By Wednesday evening a red line had appeared on his forearm. It ran from the base of his palm, up past his wrist, and toward his elbow, visible under the skin like a thread pulled taut beneath cloth. Silas saw it and went quiet. He knew what it meant. Farmers on the prairie all knew what a red line running up your arm meant. It meant the infection had entered the blood, and once it was in the blood, it went everywhere. And once it went everywhere, There was nothing to do but wait. Willa rode 4 miles to town in the dark. She found Dr. Mitchell at his house eating supper, and she told him about the red line and the swelling and the smell. Doctor Mitchell set down his fork and looked at her with the expression of a man who had delivered this particular news too many times to feel anything about it anymore. Blood poisoning, he said the words flat and final, past the arm already from the sound of it. I could take the hand, maybe the arm, but if the line is past the elbow it would not matter, and he would not let me take it anyway. They never do. Take him home. Give him whiskey if you have it. Pray if you believe in it. I am sorry. Willa rode home in the dark. 4 miles of prairie, no moon, the horse finding its way by memory. She did not cry on the ride back. She was not yet in the territory of grief. She was in the territory of tasks. There were things to do, water to boil, cloths to change, a man to sit beside, through whatever came next. What came next took 3 days. The first night Silas was lucid. He talked about the woodpile, how it was only half finished, how she would need to hire somebody to finish it. He talked about the claim, the Homestead Act, how they needed to stay through spring to prove up how, if she left, the land was gone. They had started this claim in 1881, 5 years of breaking sod and building fence and surviving winters that tested everything they knew about survival. 5 years almost complete, just months away from owning this land outright, and now this. He talked about practical things because practical things were all he knew how to talk about. Willa listened and wrote nothing down because she would remember every word he said for the rest of her life without needing paper. The second night the fever took his mind. He called for his mother, a woman named Ada, who had died of influenza 3 years before Willa ever met him. He called for a horse named Copper that he had loved when he was 12. He spoke to people who were not in the room, having conversations that Willa could hear only one side of. She sat beside him and held his hand and changed the cloths on his forehead and tried not to hear what he was saying because some of it was tender and private and meant for people she had never known. The third night, just before dawn, he came back. His eyes cleared. He looked at Willa, and for a moment he was Silas again, fully and completely the man who understood principles and built things carefully and believed the world had an order to it. His voice was rough but steady when the words came. The woodpile is not finished. I am sorry. Then he was gone. Not dramatically, not with a final breath that filled the room with significance. He simply stopped like a lamp that has run out of oil. One moment the light was there, and the next it was not. And Willa sat holding a hand that was already cooling, and the only thing she felt was the draft coming through the gaps between the logs of the cabin wall. Cold air, thin and persistent, moving across her skin like a reminder that the world did not pause for grief, that winter was coming, whether Silas was alive or not, and that the cold had been there all along, seeping through every crack, stealing warmth she could not afford to lose. She did not cry. Not yet. The crying would come later at unexpected times, in unexpected ways. For now there was only the draft and the cooling hand and the knowledge that the woodpile was not finished and never would be. They buried Silas on their land under a cottonwood sapling he had planted the previous spring. He had said it would give shade for their children to play under. They had no children. The tree would grow for decades with no children beneath it, giving shade to nothing but the grass and the grave. The funeral was small, a few neighbor families. Reverend Albright reading scripture in a voice trained for larger rooms. His wife Constance standing behind the others with an expression on her face that Willa could not read. It might have been pity, it might have been something else. At the graveside the community had already begun rearranging Willa's future. The men talked in low voices about who might buy the land if she borrowed. The women whispered about poor Willa with voices that carried more excitement than sorrow, because on the prairie, where nothing ever happened, another person's tragedy was the closest thing to entertainment, and a young widow alone with winter coming was a story with a predictable ending that everyone could discuss at length. Constance Albright was the first to say it directly. She found Willa after the service standing by the fresh mound of dirt that was already drying in the Kansas wind. "You should think about your future, Mrs. Brennan. A woman alone on the prairie is like a candle in the wind. It is only a matter of time." Constance was 42 years old, and she was the most powerful woman in the settlement. Not because she was strong, but because she was organized. She ran the women's auxiliary. She decided who received help and who did not. She distributed sympathy the way a banker distributes loans, carefully with conditions and with full expectation of repayment. She wore steel-rimmed spectacles, and her hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch the opinions right out of her face, and she spoke with the absolute certainty of a woman who had never been wrong about anything because she had never allowed herself to consider the possibility. But Constance Albright was not a villain. She was something more complicated than that, something that would take Willa months to understand. She was a woman who had survived her own disaster by surrendering and who needed every other woman to surrender too. Because if there was another way, then Constance had given up everything for nothing. That story would come later. For now, Constance stood at the graveside and offered Willa 3 choices: sell the land, move to town, find work as a housekeeper or school teacher. Accept an introduction to a Mr. Wallace in Dodge City, a widower with a cattle operation who needed a wife to manage his household. Or allow the women's auxiliary to manage Willa's situation, which meant accepting help on Constance's terms, which meant accepting Constance's control. Willa listened. She did not interrupt. When Constance finished, Willa's voice was quiet but clear. "Thank you, Mrs. Albright. I will think about it." She would not think about it, but saying so would have started a fight, and Willa did not have the energy for a fight. She had the energy for survival, and survival meant not wasting strength on battles that did not matter. Constance turned to leave, and then she paused. Her back was to Willa, and her voice was quieter when she spoke, almost soft, almost human. "I also once thought I could manage alone." She did not finish the sentence. She did not explain what she meant, or what she had lost, or why the sentence carried the weight that it carried. She simply walked away across the brown prairie grass toward the minister's wagon, leaving the unfinished words hanging in the air like a question that Willa would not know how to answer for a very long time. After the funeral, when everyone had gone and the prairie was quiet again, Willa did what Silas would have done. She took inventory, not because she was strong. She was not strong. She was hollowed out, numb, operating on a kind of automatic setting that her body had switched to because the alternative was to sit on the floor and not get up. She inventoried because she did not know what else to do, and doing something, anything, was better than sitting in a cabin that smelled like fever and death and feeling the draft come through the walls. She counted the woodpile. 4 cords approximately, maybe a little less. A Kansas winter demanded 8 to 10 cords for a cabin this size, assuming you kept the fire burning most of the day and banked it at night and accepted that some mornings you would wake up to a room so cold your breath made clouds. 4 cords was not 8. 4 cords was death by arithmetic. She inspected the cabin. Log walls chinked with mud and straw. Standard homestead construction. But the chinking had cracked after 2 dry summers and in places had fallen away entirely, leaving gaps between the logs that she could fit her fingers through. She lit a candle and held it near the walls, watching the flame bend and dance where drafts came through. The candle told her what she already knew. The cabin was not sealed. When the winter wind blew, heat from the stove would go straight through the walls and out onto the prairie, and she would burn wood as fast as she could feed it and still be cold. The stove was cast iron, small, adequate for cooking and heating if the cabin were tight. The cabin was not tight. Food was manageable. Potatoes, dried beans, salt pork, chickens. She would not starve. Starvation was not the problem. The problem was heat. The problem was always heat. She sat at the kitchen table with paper and a pencil. The same pencil Silas had used to sketch the layout of the barn he planned to build in spring, and she did the math. She did it the way Silas would have done it, carefully with columns and margins and no rounding, because rounding was lying to yourself, and the numbers deserved honesty even when honesty was cruel. 4 cords of wood. She had measured the pile that morning by pacing its length and width and height and calculating the volume. A cord is 4 feet high by 4 feet wide by 8 feet long, 128 cubic feet of stacked wood. Silas had built the pile properly with air gaps for drying, so the actual wood volume was somewhat less than the measured volume, perhaps 80 cubic feet of solid wood per cord. 4 cords meant roughly 320 cubic feet of burnable timber. A Kansas winter, she wrote, November through March, was approximately 120 days of cold that required heating. The cabin was roughly 400 square feet log walls, 10 inches thick but poorly chinked, with a single-pane window on the south wall and a door that let drafts through like a colander lets water through. At the rate this cabin consumed fuel, which she estimated based on last winter when Silas had been feeding the stove every 3 to 4 hours during the day and banking it at night, she would need roughly 1/10 of a cord per day during the coldest months. More during blizzards, less during mild spells. 1/10 was an average that erred on the side of optimism. 4 cords divided by 1/10 cord per day equaled 40 days. 40 days of fuel. Winter was 120 days. She would run out of wood before Christmas with 90 days of winter still ahead and nothing to burn except furniture. She stared at the numbers. She checked her arithmetic twice. Then she flipped the paper over and calculated the alternative. How long would it take her to split enough additional wood to survive the full winter? She had tried splitting the day after the funeral. 1 full day, sun up to sundown, swinging the axe that had killed her husband. The same axe with the same handle and the same blade that still had a dark stain on the edge that she could not bring herself to clean. Her hands blistered by mid-morning. By noon, the blisters broke. By afternoon, her palms were raw meat and her back was a knot of pain from shoulders to hips, the kind of pain that turns every movement into a negotiation between what you need to do and what your body will allow. By sundown, she had split less than a quarter cord. At that rate, she needed 16 straight days of splitting to add 4 cords. 16 days of 12-hour labor with blistered hands and a damaged back. 16 days she did not have because winter was 6 weeks away, and she also needed to harvest the garden and preserve the food and repair the chicken coop and patch the roof and do the 100 other things that Silas had always done and that now fell to her alone. And even if she could split 4 more cords in 16 days, which she could not, 8 cords for a drafty cabin was still barely enough. She would spend the entire winter feeding the stove every 3 hours, which meant waking up multiple times every night, which meant never sleeping, which meant exhaustion, which meant mistakes, which meant a fire that goes out at 3 in the morning when you are too tired to notice, which meant freezing. Every number on the paper said the same thing. She was going to die. Not probably, maybe not unless she was unlucky or the winter was particularly bad. The arithmetic was clear, and it did not care about her feelings or her determination or her refusal to sell or remarry. The numbers did not lie. They never did. 4 cords was not enough. 8 cords in a drafty cabin was barely enough, and she could not get to 8. The math was a wall, and she could not climb over it or go around it or pretend it was not there. She sat with that knowledge for a long time. The candle burned down. The cabin got dark. And then for the first time since Silas died, Willa Brennan cried. Not because she missed her husband, though she did in a way that felt less like sadness and more like having a limb removed. She cried because she was angry. Angry at Silas for dying. Angry at the axe for slipping. Angry at the tiny cut that should have healed in a week and instead killed a healthy man in 3 days. Angry at the cabin and the prairie and the wind and the cold and the entire mechanical indifference of a world that allowed a slip of a blade to turn a woman into a statistic. She sat on the floor with her back against the bed where Silas had died, and she felt the cold air coming through the walls from every direction, and she understood that this was the real enemy. Not grief, not loneliness, not the opinions of neighbors or the predictions of the minister's wife. The cold, the draft. The heat bleeding out of her cabin through every crack and gap and failure of construction, leaving her burning through wood she did not have to chase warmth she could not keep. 2 weeks after the funeral, Willa rode into town for lamp oil and rope. At the general store she met Mrs. Astrid Eriksson. Mrs. Eriksson was around 70, small white-haired, her braids pinned up in the Scandinavian style that nobody in Kansas wore except her. She spoke English with a Swedish accent so thick you had to listen at half speed to understand her. She was standing by the yarn display talking to nobody in particular, or talking to everybody within earshot, which was the same thing because nobody within earshot was listening. She had been talking this way for 15 years since her husband Eric died, and the settlement had learned to treat her the way you treat weather. You could not stop it. You could only wait for it to pass. Most people avoided her. She was old. She was foreign. She talked too much about Sweden. The settlement had decided years ago that Mrs. Eriksson was eccentric at best and senile at worst, and they gave her the wide berth that communities give to people whose knowledge does not fit into the categories they already understand. Constance Albright particularly disliked her. Mrs. Eriksson did not attend church, which in a settlement this small was practically a declaration of war. When asked why Mrs. Eriksson had said, "I talk to God in Swedish," "He understands without a minister to translate," this had not endeared her to the minister's wife. Willa stopped and listened, not because she was interested in yarn or Sweden, but because she had nowhere to be and nothing to go home to. And the old woman's voice was a sound that was not the wind, and not the silence of an empty cabin, and not the memory of Silas saying, "The woodpile is not finished," Mrs. Eriksson noticed immediately. Her eyes pale blue and sharp behind wrinkled lids fixed on Willa, with the sudden focus of someone who has been ignored for so long that genuine attention feels like sunlight. "Who are you?" The question came out blunt, unfiltered by social convention. "You look cold," Willa told her. The Brennan widow. Mrs. Eriksson did not say sorry for your loss. She did not say God works in mysterious ways. She did not offer the standard phrases that people use to acknowledge grief without having to engage with it. She said, "Your cabin. Which direction does it face?" Willa blinked. "Door faces south. Long walls run east to west." Mrs. Eriksson nodded as if Willa had confirmed a diagnosis. "North wall. That is your problem. The wind from Canada comes through the north wall. It comes across 1,000 miles of flat nothing and hits your logs and goes right through them like they are not there." Then she began talking about air. She talked for 20 minutes right there in the general store, standing by the yarn with a skein of gray wool in her hand that she never put down and never paid for. She talked about Uppsala, where she had grown up, about winters that dropped to 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit and stayed there for weeks, about houses that were warm inside, not because they had bigger fires or thicker walls, but because the people who built them understood something about heat and cold that the Americans on this prairie had never learned. In Sweden, she said, her accent thick, but her meaning as clear as glass, we learned that still air does not conduct heat. Moving air, yes, moving air is a thief. It grabs the warmth from a room and carries it away through every crack, every gap, every place where it can flow. But air that cannot move, air that is trapped in a space too small for it to circulate, that air is like a blanket made of nothing. It holds the warmth on one side and keeps the cold on the other. And it does this without fuel, without fire, without any effort at all. She held up 2 fingers. The nails were clean, but the knuckles were swollen with age, and the fingers trembled slightly, but they were precise. 2 inches. If you hang a cloth 2 inches from a cold wall, the air between the cloth and the wall becomes dead air trapped still. It cannot move. It cannot circulate. It cannot convect. The cold from the wall hits the dead air and stops. Your room stays warm, not because you are adding heat, but because you are stopping the heat you have from leaving. She lowered her fingers and looked at Willa with an expression that was not pity and not sympathy, but something more useful, which was the expression of a person who has a solution and is waiting to see if the other person is smart enough to hear it. 2 inches, not more. More than 2 inches, and the air begins to move, to circulate, to form convection currents. And once air moves, it is alive again. And alive air steals heat the same as wind. Less than 2 inches, and the cloth touches the wall, and the cold conducts straight through the fabric as if it were not there. 2 inches exactly. Remember this number. She also told Willa about something she called an airlock. In Uppsala, every house had a heavy curtain hung 3 feet inside the front door, floor to ceiling, creating a small space between the door and the room. When you open the front door, cold air rushes in, but it hits the curtain and stops. It can fill the small vestibule between door and curtain, but it cannot reach the main room. When you close the door and push through the curtain, only a small pocket of cold air comes with you, a breath instead of a flood. Every house in Uppsala had this. Every house for hundreds of years. It was not a Swedish invention. It was common sense made permanent. The kind of solution that seems obvious only after someone has shown it to you. As Erickson paused and looked at Willa with an expression that held both assessment and hope. The look of a teacher deciding whether the student was worth the time. My husband Eric built our cabin with double walls, 2 layers of logs with air between them. He was a carpenter. He knew how to do things properly. When he died, I could not maintain the double wall construction alone. So I did the next best thing. I hung fabric on the inside walls 2 inches out the way my grandmother had done in our house in Uppsala when we were too poor for double walls. I have been doing this for 15 years alone. Nobody has asked me about it in 15 years. Nobody has come to see my cabin and wonder why it is warm. You are the first person who has listened to me talk about air and not walked away before I finished. She smiled, and the smile was sad and pleased at the same time, the way smiles are when they contain years of being ignored. It is not new knowledge. It is old knowledge. Old knowledge that the Americans on this prairie have never bothered to learn because they believe the answer to cold is always more fire, more wood, more fuel, more burning. Fight the cold harder. Push back. Force your way through the winter with strength and sweat and 8 cords of firewood. But the Swedes learned a different lesson a long time ago. We learned that you cannot outburn the winter. It is bigger than you. It has more cold than you have fire. So instead of fighting it, you stop the heat from leaving. You do less, not more. You let the air do the work. Willa rode home with the old woman's words turning in her mind. She stood in the middle of her cabin and looked at everything with new eyes. She did not see log walls anymore. She saw pathways, routes that heat traveled on its way out of her life. The cracked chinking between the logs, the gaps where the mud had fallen away, the thin single-pane window, the door that did not seal. Every surface was a road leading from warm to cold, from inside to outside, from survival to death. And she had been trying to fight all those roads by burning more fuel, which was like trying to fill a bathtub with the drain open. You could pour water in as fast as you wanted. If the drain was open, the tub would never fill. Mrs. Erickson had not told her to pour more water. She had told her to close the drain. Then Willa looked at the quilts. They were in the cedar chest by the bed, folded carefully, layered with sachets of dried lavender that her mother had packed between them when she gave them to Willa as a wedding gift. Her grandmother Martha's quilts. Martha had been a quilter in Virginia, known across 2 counties for work that people said was too beautiful to use, which Martha had always considered the stupidest compliment possible, because quilts were not paintings. They were tools. They were made to keep people warm. The heaviest quilt was the log cabin pattern. Thick cotton batting between 2 layers of pieced fabric, the blocks arranged in the traditional light and dark pattern that represented the warmth of the hearth on one side and the dark of the wilderness on the other. Grandmother Martha had made it for Willa's mother, and Willa's mother had given it to Willa, and now it lay in a cedar chest in a cabin on the Kansas prairie, kept safe, kept clean, kept folded, kept useless. Willa opened the chest and put her hand on the quilt and hesitated. It felt like sacrilege, driving pegs into walls and hanging heirloom quilts like curtains, using the work of a woman who had spent months on every stitch as if it were a sheet of canvas or a piece of burlap. Her grandmother had not made these quilts so they could be nailed to a wall, but her grandmother had not made them so they could sit in a chest while her granddaughter froze to death either. Willa closed her eyes and asked the question that Silas had taught her to ask, the question that was his real legacy, the question that would save her life. She asked, "What is the principle? What is the purpose?" The purpose of a quilt is to keep people warm. That was why Grandmother Martha had made them, not to be admired in a drawer, not to be respected in storage, to keep the people she loved alive through the winter. And if hanging this quilt on a wall with 2 inches of dead air behind it could do that, then it was not sacrilege. It was the fulfillment of the purpose for which it was made. Willa began cutting pegs from a piece of oak firewood. Each peg 3/4 of an inch in diameter, 4 inches long, sharpened at one end to drive into the soft chinking between the logs. She measured the north wall, the one facing Canada, calculated spacing at 18 inches between pegs, figured she needed 14 pegs for the top row. She found rope in the barn, cut it to length, and practiced threading it through the edge of the quilt without tearing the fabric. The work was methodical, mechanical, a series of steps that kept her hands busy and her mind focused on something other than the arithmetic of death she had scrawled on paper the night before. She was driving the third peg into the north wall when Constance Albright walked in without knocking. "What in heaven's name are you doing?" The words came sharp and immediate, carrying the weight of a woman who had never been told that judgment was optional. Insulating. Willa did not stop working. She drove the peg in, checked the depth, moved to the next position. The mallet struck wood with a sound that rang in the small cabin like punctuation. Constance stood in the doorway and stared at the scene before her. The quilt spread out on the table, the row of pegs already in the wall, the rope, the mallet, the young widow working with steady hands and an expression that Constance could not read because it was the expression of a woman who was solving a problem, and Constance did not recognize it because she had stopped trying to solve problems a long time ago. "You are hanging quilts on your walls, not on your beds, on your walls like curtains. Your grandmother's quilts, the heirloom quilts, like wallpaper. My grandmother made them to keep people warm. This is keeping me warm." "That is not how quilts work, Mrs. Brennan. You are supposed to wrap yourself in them. You do not nail them to walls like decorations. And using your grandmother's quilts, the heirloom quilts, as wall hangings, that is disrespectful to the dead. My grandmother would rather keep me alive than be respected in a drawer." Constance adjusted her spectacles. The gesture was automatic, something she did when she needed a moment to organize her disapproval. She looked at the pegs, at the rope, at the quilt, and her lips pressed together until they nearly disappeared. "I have come to tell you that the Women's Auxiliary is meeting tomorrow to discuss your situation. Several of us are concerned that you are not managing well. Living alone with winter coming with barely enough wood to last until Christmas." Willa drove another peg. The sound rang in the cabin again, flat and final. "Mr. Wallace in Dodge City. The widower I mentioned, he has written to Reverend Albright expressing interest. He is a good man, Willa, established. He needs a wife who can manage a household. It would be a practical arrangement." "I am not interested in a husband, Mrs. Albright. I am interested in surviving the winter." "You will not survive it hanging quilts on your walls. You need firewood. You need a man to cut it. You need to accept that a woman alone cannot manage what this land demands." Willa stopped hammering. She turned and looked at Constance. For a moment the two women regarded each other across the small distance of the cabin, which was also the distance between two entirely different ways of understanding what it meant to be alive. "Thank you for your concern. The door is behind you. If you have come to help, I have more pegs that need driving. If you have come to talk, I am afraid I do not have time for that today." Constance left. She walked out with her spine rigid and her certainty intact and her predictions made. The Brennan widow would freeze before Christmas. The quilts on the walls were proof of a mind unraveling under the strain of loss and isolation. By January at the latest, they would all be dealing with the consequences of a woman who refused to accept her situation. Willa watched her go. Then she turned back to the wall and drove the next peg. By evening the north wall was done. Grandmother Martha's log cabin quilt hung from ropes straight and even 2 inches of empty air between its back and the rough log wall. Willa used a piece of wood cut to exactly 2 inches as a gauge, checking every foot of the quilt's length, making sure the gap was consistent, making sure the dead airspace was uniform from one end to the other. She stood back and looked at what she had done. A quilt on a wall, 2 inches of nothing behind it. Invisible air trapped in an invisible space doing invisible work that she could not see or touch or prove. She did not know yet if it would work. She did not know if Mrs. Erickson was right, or if Constance Albright was right, or if the numbers on the paper were right. She only knew that the numbers said she would die, and this was the only thing she had found that might make the numbers wrong. She went to bed that night with the stove banked low and the north wall quilted, and the other 3 walls still bare, and a single question in her mind as the October wind began to rise outside and the temperature dropped toward the first real cold of the season. Tomorrow she would wake up warm, or she would wake up with proof that Constance Albright had been right all along, and either way the answer would be waiting for her in the temperature of the air. She woke up warm. Not hot, not comfortable in the way a house with 2 stoves and 10 cords of wood is comfortable, but warm enough. Warm enough that she did not reach for the shawl before her feet touched the floor. Warm enough that the air in the cabin felt like air instead of like a presence trying to push her back under the blankets. The stove had burned down to coals overnight, a thin orange glow behind the iron grate, and the room should have been freezing by now. Every morning since Silas died, she had woken to cold so sharp it hurt to breathe. Every morning she had lain in bed calculating how long she could stay under the covers before she had to get up and feed the fire. And every morning the answer had been not long enough. But this morning was different. The north wall, the one facing Canada, the one that had always radiated cold like a window left open to the Arctic, was quiet. The quilt hung motionless on its rope, 2 inches of nothing between its back and the logs, and that nothing was doing something. Willa could feel it, or rather she could feel the absence of what she usually felt, which was the steady, relentless pull of cold from that wall drawing heat out of the room like water draining from a tub. She did not celebrate. She did not trust it yet. October nights in Kansas were cold, but they were not winter cold, not January cold, not the kind of cold that froze water in a bucket in 10 minutes and killed cattle standing in fields and turned the air into something that hurt your lungs when you breathed it in. This might have been coincidence. The night might not have been cold enough to test the principle. Mrs. Erickson might have been wrong, and Willa might have spent a day driving pegs into walls for nothing. So she kept working. She did not allow herself to hope. She allowed herself to continue. 2 days it took to finish all 4 walls. 2 days of measuring and cutting and hammering and adjusting alone in the cabin with nobody to help and nobody to talk to except the quilts themselves, which she spoke to as she hung them, because the silence was worse than talking to fabric, and because each quilt was in a way a person. Each one had been made by hands she knew, or hands that had touched hands she knew, and hanging them was not just construction. It was a kind of conversation with women who were gone. The east wall got her mother's quilt, the double wedding ring pattern made from scraps of dresses worn by women in the family going back 3 generations. Lighter than Martha's quilt, but tightly woven, the cotton dense and smooth. Willa threaded the rope through the edge, carefully holding her breath each time the needle passed through the fabric, terrified of tearing the stitching that her mother's fingers had placed there 20 years ago. The west wall got 2 smaller quilts stitched together with rough thread because neither one was wide enough to cover the wall alone. One was a quilt. Willa had made herself badly, the stitching uneven and the pattern crooked, a failed attempt at her grandmother's craft that she had kept out of stubbornness rather than pride. The other was a store-bought blanket, thin but serviceable. She hung them side by side with the edges overlapping, covering every inch of log, leaving no timber exposed to radiate cold into the room. The south wall was the one with the window, and it got the quilt she and Silas had bought together in Wichita on their honeymoon. A simple 9-patch in blue and white, nothing special as quilts went, but it was theirs, the only thing they had chosen together that was not a tool or a necessity or a piece of equipment for the business of surviving on the prairie. She rigged it on a sliding rope so she could pull it aside during the day to let in what little winter sun Kansas offered and draw it back at night to seal the window and the wall. She cut strips of wool from an old blanket and stuffed them into every gap around the doorframe, pressing them tight with a butter knife, sealing every crack and crevice and whistle hole until the door was as close to airtight as wood and wool could make it. She rolled a blanket and pushed it against the bottom of the door where the biggest gap was the one that let in a ribbon of cold air every time the wind blew from any direction at all. Then she built the airlock. A heavy wool curtain, the darkest and thickest piece of fabric she had hung from a rope, stretched across the cabin 3 feet inside the front door. Floor to ceiling, edge to edge, with no gap at the sides where she tacked the fabric to the log walls with small nails. When you opened the front door, cold air would rush into the small vestibule between the door and the curtain, but the curtain would stop it. The cold air could fill that 3-foot space and go no further. When you closed the door and pushed through the curtain, only a small breath of cold came with you, instead of the flood that used to pour through the cabin every time someone entered or left. When she finished, the cabin looked like nothing she had ever seen. Walls covered in fabric of every color and pattern, a curtain where no curtain should be, wool stuffed into every crack. It looked like the inside of a quilting basket. If Silas could see it, he would have looked at it for a long time without speaking, and then he would have asked her to explain the principle. And when she explained it, he would have nodded once and said nothing else, because Silas did not need things to look right. He needed to know why they worked. That first evening she built a fire half the size she normally would. She sat at the table with a cup of coffee and waited, not patiently, not calmly, but with the tight, controlled anxiety of a person who has bet everything on a single idea and is about to find out if the idea is worth anything. The cabin warmed slowly at first, like a pot of water coming to temperature, the heat accumulating in the air instead of bleeding through the walls, building on itself in a way that Willa had never felt before in this room. Within an hour the difference was unmistakable. The warmth was not fighting to exist. It was simply there, held in place by the quilts and the dead air behind them, contained in the room the way water is contained in a jar. She took off her shawl. She sat with her hands flat on the table instead of tucked under her arms. The room was not hot, but it was warm, the kind of warm that let you think about something other than being cold. But she did not trust it. One warm evening in October proved nothing. She banked the fire low and went to bed and waited to wake up shivering at 3 in the morning the way she had every night for weeks. The doubt lasted 3 weeks. Every morning she woke up a little warmer than she expected, and every morning she told herself it was because October was not yet cold enough to test the system properly. She was afraid to believe it was working, because believing meant having something to lose, and she had already lost enough. Then November came, and the temperature dropped off a cliff. The first night below zero arrived in the first week of November with no warning and no apology. Willa lay in bed and listened to the wind, that particular low moan that the prairie makes when Canada sends its air south across 1,000 miles of flat nothing. Last winter, with Silas feeding the stove every 3 hours, that wind had meant waking up cold. This winter alone, stove banked low quilts on every wall. It meant an answer she had been waiting 3 weeks to receive. She lay still. She listened to the wind. She felt the air in the room. The cabin held, not perfectly. She could feel a coolness near the floor, a subtle chill that rose through the boards from the frozen ground beneath, a reminder that the quilts on the walls could not help what came from below. But the walls themselves were silent. The dead air was doing its work. The cold came from the north and crossed the prairie and hit the log wall and pushed through the gaps in the chinking and met 2 inches of trapped, motionless, still air. And it stopped. The heat from the stove, small as it was, stayed in the room. It accumulated through the night instead of dissipating, building a reserve of warmth that the cabin held, the way a thermos holds coffee, not by generating heat, but by preventing its escape. Willa lay in the dark and understood with a certainty that settled into her bones that she was going to live. The numbers on the paper had been wrong, not because the arithmetic was wrong, but because the arithmetic had been solving the wrong problem. She had been calculating how much wood she needed to heat the cabin. The right question was how much wood she needed to keep the cabin from losing the heat it already had. And the answer to that question was much, much less. She cried, not the angry tears she had cried the night she did the math. These were quieter. They came from a place that was deeper and simpler than anger. Relief. The pure biological relief of an animal that has been cornered and has found a way out. She pressed her face into the pillow and wept until there was nothing left. Then she wiped her face and got up and put a small piece of wood on the coals and made coffee and sat at the table in a warm cabin on a 0-degree Kansas night and drank it slowly and alone. Word spread through the settlement, the way all information spreads on the prairie, which is through the mouths of women at wells, at the store, at the church door, before and after services on Sunday. The Brennan widow has hung quilts on her walls, not on her beds, on her walls, like wallpaper, like drapes, using her grandmother's heirloom quilts, the good ones, the ones that should have been kept safe in a chest for her daughters if she ever had daughters, which she would not because she refused to remarry, which was another thing everyone was talking about. Constance Albright made certain the story was told in the way that served her predictions. She has lost her mind. Living alone has damaged her judgment. Quilts on walls. Her grandmother's quilts nailed up with pegs and hung from ropes like laundry. It is a matter of time before we find her frozen, and when we do, remember that we offered help and she refused it. The women nodded. The men shook their heads. Nobody went to look for themselves. The story was easier to believe than the truth, and the truth would have required admitting that a widow with 4 cords of wood might know something that all of them with their 8 and 9 and 10 cords did not. Willa felt the isolation, but she did not fight it. Fighting would have cost energy she needed for other things. At church on Sundays, people spoke around her instead of to her. They formed conversations that happened to exclude her not with cruelty, but with the practiced ease of a community that has decided what is true and does not want to be confused by evidence. Constance nodded at her from across the room with the thin smile of a woman keeping score. Willa nodded back and bought her lamp oil and went home. Mrs. Erickson heard about the gossip at the general store. She rode her old mare to Willa's cabin the next afternoon carrying a jar of goat milk and a loaf of dark bread that tasted like cardamom and rye and another country. "They are talking about you." She said this while settling into the chair by the stove with the ease of a woman who had long ago stopped caring what anyone said about her. "The minister's wife tells everyone you will freeze." "I know, Mrs." Erickson looked at the quilts on the walls, at the curtain by the door, at the stove burning low, and she smiled. It was the smile of a woman who had been right about something for 40 years and had never once been given credit for it. Do not fight mouths with mouths. Survive. When spring comes and you are still standing here, their words will be dust on the wind. This is the second thing I teach you, Willa. The first was about air. This one is about people. Do not waste warmth on those who want you cold. The blizzard came in the 3rd week of December. It arrived the way prairie blizzards do, with 3 days of gray sky that could have been anything, followed by a sudden violent shift that left no time for preparation. The wind swung north. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 4 hours. The snow came not from above, but from the side horizontal sheets of white that erased the world and replaced it with a howling blank nothing that went on in every direction forever. 4 days it lasted. The worst storm in 10 years, people would say afterward, with the peculiar pride that prairie people take in the severity of their weather, as if surviving it were an accomplishment rather than an accident. Willa was alone in her cabin with enough wood for maybe 10 days if she was careful, and a system of quilts and dead air that had never been tested against anything approaching this. The first day was manageable. The cabin held its warmth. The quilts did their work. The stove burned low and the room stayed comfortable. Willa felt a flutter of something that might have been confidence, which was a mistake, because the prairie does not reward confidence. It rewards preparation, and preparation is not the same thing. The second day the temperature kept falling and the wind found new angles pressing against the cabin from the northwest instead of due north. Willa heard sounds she had not heard before. Creaking, groaning, the logs contracting as the cold tightened its grip on the timber. The wood shrinking and the gaps between the logs widening by fractions of an inch that the chinking could not accommodate. The quilts held. The dead air worked. But something else was happening. Something she had not planned for. The cold was coming from below the floor. Bare pine planks laid directly on the frozen ground with nothing between them and the earth but a few inches of air that was not dead at all, that moved freely in the crawl space beneath the cabin, that carried the cold of the frozen ground up through the wood and into the room like a river of ice flowing upward. Willa could not put her bare feet on the floor without gasping. The stove heated the air at chest level and above, but the floor pulled that heat downward into the ground, and no quilt on any wall could stop what was coming from beneath. She had not thought about the floor. Mrs. Erickson had not mentioned it, or perhaps she had in the flow of her 20-minute monologue at the general store and Willa had not caught it, had been too focused on the walls and the door and the 2-inch gap to hear the part about what was under her feet. The third night was the worst. Temperature outside somewhere below -20. Wind without pause, without variation. A constant roar that was not weather, but geology. The sound of a continent funneling its cold through a single point on the map where Willa's cabin happened to stand. She fed the stove as much as she dared, more than she wanted, watching the woodpile math change with every piece she added. The cabin was warm from the waist up and freezing from the knees down, a bizarre split sensation, like standing with half your body in one season and half in another. She sat on the bed with her feet drawn up blankets around her, and she looked at the stove and the wood pile and the quilts on the walls that were working perfectly, and the floor that was defeating all of it, and she thought, maybe Constance is right. Maybe I cannot do this. The thought was not dramatic. It did not arrive with tears or despair. It arrived the way a fact arrives, quietly settling into the available space in her mind like dust settling on a shelf. Maybe this was always how it was going to end. Maybe the arithmetic was right after all and the quilts were just a delay. A few extra weeks of warmth before the cold found the weakness she had missed and came through it and took everything. That night she dreamed of Silas. He stood at the cabin door with snow on his shoulders, and he looked at her with the expression he had worn in the last clear moment before the fever took him for good. "The woodpile is not finished. I am sorry." His voice carried the same rough steadiness it had carried in life, and when she woke with tears on her cheeks at 3 a.m, she realized she had been speaking out loud to a dead man in a dark cabin that half the settlement believed was proof she had lost her reason. For a moment, sitting in the dark with the wind screaming and the floor like ice, and the dream still vivid behind her eyes, she was not sure of anything at all. But she did not quit. Not because she was brave, not because she was determined, not because she was the kind of person who refuses to give up no matter what. She did not quit because there was nowhere to go. Quitting meant walking 4 miles through a blizzard that would kill her before she got halfway. Quitting meant dying in the snow instead of dying in the cabin. And if she was going to die, she preferred to die warm and with the quilts around her. So she stayed. And staying was not courage. It was the absence of a better option. The 4th day, the storm broke. Willa opened the door and the world was white and still and so bright it hurt her eyes. She counted her remaining wood. She had burned roughly half a cord in 4 days. Without the quilts and dead air, 4 days of that blizzard would have consumed a cord and a half, maybe more. Even with the floor problem, the system had cut her fuel use by more than half. She went to Mrs. Erickson the day the roads were passable. The old woman was in her own cabin, quilted and warm, and she nodded before Willa finished her first sentence about the floor. The floor? Yes. I should have been more clear. In Uppsala we covered our floors with compressed hay packed thick 8 inches or more, then covered with cloth. The hay stems are hollow. Each one is a tiny tube of trapped air. Thousands of them, millions each one holding a small pocket of still air inside its walls. Same principle as the dead air behind your quilts, but at a smaller scale. The cold from the ground enters the hay and meets all those tiny dead air pockets and cannot pass through them easily. The floor stays warmer. Animal hides work too. Anything that contains trapped air in small spaces that cannot circulate. She leaned forward, her pale blue eyes vivid with the pleasure of explaining something she had understood for 70 years to someone who could finally hear it. This is also why wool keeps you warmer than cotton. Wool fibers are curled, crimped, twisted. Between the fibers are thousands of tiny air pockets. Cotton fibers are flat. They press against each other and trap less air. It is always about trapped air. Everything about warmth is about trapped air. The quilts on your wall, the hay on the floor, the wool on your body, the feathers on a bird, all of it. Air that cannot move, air that does nothing. And in doing nothing, it does everything. Willa went home and pulled straw from the chicken coop as much as she could take without leaving the birds on bare ground, and she packed it 6 inches deep across the cabin floor and covered it with canvas. It was not the compressed hay of Swedish farmhouses. It was not perfect, but it was straw with hollow stems and trapped air inside them. And when she stepped on it the next morning, the floor was cool instead of frozen. And the difference between cool and frozen was the difference between surviving and not. January came, the dead center of winter, the coldest month, the darkest month, the month when the wood piles of the Kansas prairie shrank fastest, and the spirits of the people who depended on them shrank with them. Willa heard the numbers at church in fragments of conversation she was not supposed to overhear but did because people talk loudly when they are worried, and she was always listening. The Suttner family, George and Ruth and 3 children, the youngest, only 2 had burned 7 cords and were running low. Their cabin had never been properly chinked and the wind went through it like a sieve. The Cooper family had burned 9 cords with thicker walls but a door that might as well have been open. The church itself, Reverend Albright's project and pride, had consumed 11 cords, and the congregation still sat shivering through Sunday services in coats and scarves and hats. The Albright house had burned 9 cords, with 2 stoves running dawn to dark, and Constance still wore her shawl indoors, still wrapped herself in layers that spoke of a cold that no amount of firewood seemed able to reach. Willa had burned 4 cords total since October. Her woodpile was still nearly half full. Her cabin was warm. Her stove burned low. She slept through the night every night and woke up to a room that was comfortable and a fire that was still alive. The contrast became impossible to ignore, and it was not Willa who made it visible. It was old Mr. Jenkins, her nearest neighbor, who came by on a January afternoon to return a book he had borrowed from Silas the previous summer. He stepped through the door, through the airlock curtain, into the main room, and he stopped in the middle of a sentence and looked around with the expression of a man who has walked into a room that does not match his expectations in any way. "How in the world is it this warm in here? You have barely got a fire going," Willa explained. Jenkins listened. He was 70 and he was practical, and he had no patience for nonsense, but unlimited patience for things that worked. He touched the quilt on the north wall. He felt the air behind it. He looked at the stove. He did mental arithmetic. "I have burned 8 cords this winter, and my house is colder than this right now." He left and told nobody because Jenkins was the kind of man who held information until he was sure of it. But the information was there now in the mind of a man the settlement respected, and it would surface when the time was right. The time came 3 weeks later on a night in the 3rd week of January when somebody knocked on Willa's door after dark. She opened it and found Gideon Tate on her porch, snow in his hair, 3 children behind him. His wife Ruth, holding the 2-year-old, the baby bundled in every scrap of cloth they owned, coughing small wet sounds that Willa could hear through the wrappings. The older children stood with red noses and wide, frightened eyes, the kind of eyes that children get when they understand that the adults do not have an answer and the cold is coming in and nobody can stop it. Gideon Tate was 35, big, strong, capable, with hands that could build a barn or break a horse or dig a well in a day. But he could not make his cabin warm. He had stuffed every crack with rags and burned 7 cords, and the wind still came through, and the children still shivered, and the baby's cough had gotten worse every night for a week. And tonight, with the temperature dropping below 0 again, and the woodpile nearly gone, he had picked up his children and walked through the dark to the one house in the settlement that was said to be warm. He had not defended Willa when Constance mocked her. He had not spoken up at the auxiliary meeting. He had not visited, not offered help, not acknowledged that what she was doing might have value. He had been silent when silence was easy because silence cost nothing, and speaking would have meant standing against the current of the community. Gideon Tate had never in his life stood against any current of anything. Now he stood at her door, unable to meet her eyes. "My cabin is too cold. The wood is almost gone. The children." He did not finish. He did not know how to finish a sentence that began with, "I need help from someone I did not help." Willa looked at the baby coughing in Ruth's arms, at the older children with their frightened eyes, at Gideon Tate, big and strong and useless against the one enemy that strength could not defeat. She opened the door wider. "Come in." The warmth hit the Tate family the way water hits a person dying of thirst. Ruth started crying before she was fully through the curtain. The children pressed toward the stove with the instinct of small animals seeking heat. The baby stopped coughing within minutes as if the warm air itself were medicine, which in a way it was because cold air constricts the airways and warm air opens them, and sometimes the simplest explanation is the truest one. That night, while the Tate children slept on Willa's floor, wrapped in quilts that were not on the walls, Willa and Gideon walked back to the Tate cabin through the snow. Willa carried rope and pegs and the 2-inch measuring stick. Gideon carried a lantern, and the willingness to learn that comes to a man only when his children are in danger and his pride has been burned away to nothing. They worked until 2 in the morning. They hung everything they could find on the walls of the Tate cabin. Blankets, canvas, burlap sacks, old coats nailed up by the collars with the sleeves hanging down like empty arms. Nothing matched. Nothing looked right. The cabin looked like a rag picker's warehouse, but everything hung 2 inches from the walls, checked with the gauge, and they stuffed the door frame with rags and hung a horse blanket for an airlock. And when they finished at nearly dawn, the cabin was already warmer than it had been all winter. Gideon understood the principle instantly. He was not educated, but he was smart with his hands and smart with materials, and the moment Willa explained dead air, he grasped it, the way a carpenter grasps a new joint technique completely and permanently. Then he said something that surprised her. What if I sew 2 layers of burlap together with a gap between them? Air trapped between 2 layers of fabric, and then air trapped between the outer layer and the wall. Dead air inside, dead air outside. Would that work better, Mrs.? Erickson would like that idea. Gideon nodded. He did not say thank you. Gratitude was not what he felt, or if he felt it, he did not have the words for it. What he felt was the particular combination of relief and shame that comes from being saved by someone you failed to save. And he dealt with it the only way he knew how, which was by looking at Willa and saying 6 words that were worth more than any apology. I will tell Jenkins in the morning. Willa walked home alone through the pre-dawn dark. The prairie was white under stars. Behind her, the Tate cabin held heat for the first time all winter, ugly with its mismatched burlap and canvas, but warm, finally, blessedly warm. Ahead of her, her own cabin waited quilted and still, the dead air patient behind every wall. Word spread through the settlement differently after that, not mockery anymore. The tone changed the way the wind changes when a front passes, not gradually but all at once. People were talking about the quilted walls, not with amusement, but with curiosity, not with condescension, but with the particular hunger of people who had been cold all winter and had just learned they did not have to be. They came to see. 1 family at first, then 3, then a dozen. They stepped through the airlock and into the warm room, and they felt what Constance had not yet felt but would soon feel, the warmth that should not have been possible with a stove that small and a fire that low. And they asked the question that Constance would eventually ask. How Willa explained to every family that came. The same explanation each time, patient and precise, because the principle was simple and simplicity was the point. 2 inches, still air, dead air. Cold stops, heat stays. She showed them the pegs, the ropes, the gap between the fabric and the wall. She let them feel the dead air with their hands, the subtle difference in temperature between the room side of the quilt and the wall side. Mrs. Erickson came with them. She was old and slow, and she had to be helped down from the wagon, but her mind was as sharp as a blade, and her delight in being finally publicly irrefutably right after 40 years of being dismissed was so vivid that it seemed to take 10 years off her face. She drew diagrams in the dirt with a stick, her broken English animated by the kind of excitement that only comes from knowledge being received at last by people who need it. Still air holds heat because it cannot carry it away. Moving air steals heat because it can. 2 inches is the width that prevents the air from circulating. More than 2 inches and the air moves. Less than 2 inches and the fabric touches the wall. 2 inches, always 2 inches. This is not my idea. This is not Swedish. This is how the world works. We in Sweden simply noticed it earlier because our winters made noticing it a matter of life and death. George Suttner came too, and he brought his innovation. The double-layer burlap panels he had sewn rough and ugly, 2 sheets of burlap stitched together at the edges with an air space between them, then hung 2 inches from the wall. Dead air between the burlap layers, dead air between the outer layer and the wall, 2 barriers instead of 1. He had tested it in his own cabin, and the improvement over single layer was noticeable, not enormous but real, and the principle was sound. Old Jenkins nodded when George explained it, and wrote the measurements down on the back of a feed receipt with a pencil stub. Jenkins had been a carpenter before he was a farmer, and he understood materials, and he was already thinking about how to build the principle into new construction instead of retrofitting it onto old. Double walls. 2 layers of planking with a permanent air gap between them. You would never need quilts on the walls because the dead air would be built into the house itself. 6 families hung quilts that winter after seeing Willa's cabin. 12 families hung them the following fall before the first snow. By the winter of 1887, half the settlement had fabric on their walls in one form or another, and heavy cloth of any kind had become scarce at the general store, its price driven up by demand that the storekeeper had not anticipated and could not easily meet. February was the month Constance Albright's certainty finally broke. She came on a Tuesday afternoon wrapped in so many layers of wool and cotton and fur that she appeared to have been assembled from a pile of winter clothing by someone who believed that more was always better, and that the solution to cold was always additional fabric on the body rather than still air against the wall. Her spectacles fogged when she breathed. Her nose was red. Her lips were thin and pressed together, and her eyes behind the fogged lenses held an expression that Willa had not seen on Constance's face before. It was not disapproval. It was not the satisfaction disguised as sympathy that Constance wore to funerals and sick beds and the homes of women who had failed to meet her expectations. It was something raw and more honest than anything Constance usually allowed on her face, and it looked, if Willa had to name it, like a woman who had been counting the days until she was proven right and had run out of days. "Mrs. Brennan, I have come to see how you are managing." "I am managing fine. Better than fine. I noticed your woodpile seems larger than expected for February." Willa scattered the last of the grain for the chickens and wiped her hands on her apron and turned to face the wagon. She was wearing a wool dress and a light shawl. Nothing else. No scarf, no hat, no gloves, no coat. She was feeding chickens in February in Kansas, dressed the way you would dress in October if October were mild, and the fact of her body standing in the cold without shivering was itself an argument that no words could have made more effectively. Would you like to come inside and see why Constance did not want to come inside? She had spent 5 months telling everyone within hearing distance that Willa Brennan would freeze to death in her quilted cabin, that the fabric on the walls was a symptom of grief turned to madness, that by Christmas at the latest, and certainly by January, and absolutely beyond any doubt by February, the community would be burying another widow who had refused to accept reality. She had said these things with such conviction and such frequency that they had become part of the settlement's shared understanding, repeated at wells and stores and kitchen tables as established fact. Now it was February, and Willa was standing outside in a light shawl, and the woodpile was half full, and every prediction Constance had made was lying on the ground like a fence blown over in a storm. And Constance could either keep pretending the fence was standing, or she could climb down from the wagon and walk through the door and see what had knocked it down. She climbed down. She followed Willa to the cabin. Willa opened the outer door and stepped into the vestibule between the door and the curtain, and Constance followed, and the first thing she noticed was that the vestibule was cool but not cold, a buffer zone, a transition between the world outside and whatever was inside. Then Willa pushed through the curtain and held it aside, and Constance stepped through, and the warmth hit her in the face like opening the door of a bread oven. She stopped. She stood in the main room of the cabin, and the warmth wrapped around her, and she could not speak because what she was feeling did not match anything her mind had prepared her to feel. The room was comfortable, not merely not cold, comfortable. The kind of warm that Constance associated with the homes of wealthy people in Kansas City who had coal furnaces and hired men to feed them houses where you could sit in a chair without a shawl and drink coffee without your hands shaking. But this was not Kansas City. This was a one-room homestead cabin on the open prairie with a single cast-iron stove that was barely burning more ash and coals than flame, a faint red glow that should not have been capable of heating a cupboard, let alone an entire room in the depth of a Kansas February. Constance looked around. Her spectacles had cleared in the warm air, and she could see everything now with the sharpness that had always been her gift and her curse. Because Constance Albright noticed things. She had always noticed things, and what she noticed now was killing her. Quilts on every wall, fabric hanging straight and still, not touching the logs behind them. A gap of a few inches between the cloth and the timber. The gap was consistent. The quilts were not draped casually or pinned haphazardly. They were hung with precision, with care, with the attention to measurement that spoke of someone who understood that the details mattered, that 2 inches was not the same as 3 or 1, that precision was the difference between a principle that worked and a decoration that did not. How? Her voice was small. It was the smallest Willa had ever heard it. Stripped of its usual architecture of certainty, divested of the scaffolding of authority and opinion, and the accumulated weight of 5 months of predictions. It was just a voice. A woman's voice asking a question she did not want answered, because the answer would cost her something she could not afford to lose. "How is it this warm?" "You have barely got a fire going. The quilts." Willa said it simply, not with triumph, not with the satisfaction of vindication, not with any of the dozen emotions that a person who has been mocked for 5 months and proven right might reasonably have felt. She said it the way you explain the weather plainly, because the explanation was a fact, and facts do not require decoration. They hang 2 inches from every surface. The air between the quilt and the wall is trapped. It cannot move. Still air does not conduct heat efficiently. The cold from the logs hits the dead air and stops there. The warmth from the stove stays in the room instead of bleeding through the walls and out onto the prairie. The straw on the floor does the same thing from below, trapping air in the hollow stems. The curtain at the door stops cold air from flooding in when I open it. That is all. There is no secret, just physics. That is not possible. But Constance's voice had no force behind it. The words were habit, the last reflex of a certainty that had already collapsed. It is happening right now. You are standing in it. Willa pulled a chair from the table. She went to the stove and poured coffee from the pot that sat on the warming shelf. She set the cup in front of Constance. "It has been warm all morning. Does not take much heat to keep a pot warm when the heat does not leave the room." Constance sat. She picked up the cup with both hands the way you hold something when you need something to hold. She drank. The coffee was warm, not because the stove was roaring, but because the room was efficient, because the heat generated by a small fire was retained instead of wasted, because dead air was doing work that 9 cords of firewood had failed to do in Constance's own house. She set the cup down, and the sound it made on the wooden table was very small in the quiet room. "How much wood have you burned this winter?" "About 4 cords, maybe 4.5. 4 cords. Constance repeated the number the way you repeat something that has broken a piece of your understanding. Not with disbelief, with the flat recognition of a fact that has arrived too late to be useful, but too clearly to be denied. "I have burned 9. My husband has burned 11 in the church. You do not have dead air spaces. Your heat goes straight through the walls. Every log is a road from warm to cold. Every gap in the chinking is an open door. You are heating the prairie, Mrs. Albright. The wind does not get tired, but your wood pile does." Silence. Long silence. The kind of silence that forms when a truth has entered a room, and both people in the room know it is there, and neither one has decided yet what to do about it. Then Constance spoke again, and her voice was different, not small, not defeated, something else, something that sounded like a wall cracking from inside a sound you hear only if you are very close and very quiet. "I lost a child. My first. A girl. 3 days after she was born. In a cabin in Ohio. In the winter." She was not looking at Willa. She was looking at the quilt on the north wall, Grandmother Martha's log cabin pattern, the blocks of light and dark, the warmth and the wilderness. But she was not seeing the quilt. She was seeing a different cabin, a different wall, a different winter that had happened 30 years ago and had never really ended. The cabin was cold, always cold. I did everything I was told to do. I wrapped her in blankets. I fed the fire. I prayed. The fire went out at 3 in the morning and I could not get it lit again. By dawn the room was so cold my breath hung in the air like fog. When I picked up my daughter she was already still. She stopped. Her hands were around the coffee cup. Her knuckles were white. Nobody told me there was a way to keep a cabin warm without burning half a forest. Nobody told me about dead air. Nobody told me the air between a blanket and a wall could matter. I did what I knew how to do, and it was not enough. And my daughter died. And I have spent 30 years telling myself there was nothing else I could have done. She looked up. Her eyes behind the spectacles were dry, but they were not hard. They were the eyes of a woman who has just set down something she has been carrying for 3 decades and does not know what her hands are supposed to do now that they are empty. And now you are sitting here in February with 4 cords of wood and a warm room and a fire that barely burns. And I am sitting here with 9 cords and a cold house. And I have been wrong, Willa, not about you, about everything, about the whole shape of my life. The cabin was silent. The coals shifted in the stove with a soft sound. Outside, the February wind blew across the prairie and found the cabin and pushed against the walls and met the quilts and the dead air and could go no further. And the warmth inside remained where it was steady and patient and immovable. Willa did not say she was sorry about Constance's daughter. She did not say, "I forgive you for the months of mockery." She did not say any of the things that a person might say in a story that cared more about drama than about truth. She reached for the coffee pot and she poured more into Constance's cup, and the gesture was small and plain, and it was the only language the moment could bear. Constance picked up the cup. She held it for a long time. Then she set it down unfinished, and she stood, and she walked out of the cabin without saying another word. She climbed onto the wagon. She drove away across the white prairie, a small figure growing smaller against the enormous sky, and she did not look back. That evening in the Albright house, Constance sat alone at the kitchen table after her husband had fallen asleep. The 2 stoves burned, the rooms were chilly. She did not think about the baby again. She had said what she needed to say, and she would not say it again. Not to Willa, not to her husband, not to anyone. What she thought about instead was the quilts, the 2-inch gap, the dead air. She thought about it with the practical attention of a woman who had managed a household for 20 years, and she began to calculate what she would need. Fabric rope pegs. She knew where the pegs were in the barn. She knew which blankets she could spare. She could do it in a day if she worked alone, and she would work alone because she would not ask for help, and she would not tell anyone what she was doing. And if anyone asked why there was fabric on her walls, she would say it was for decoration and dare them to disagree.